The recognition of spiritual alchemy within one's own consciousness presents itself not as a mystical revelation, but as a fundamental epistemological crisis that demands resolution. When the seeker begins to identify the classical signs of alchemical transformation manifesting in their inner life, they are not merely experiencing psychological change, they are participating in an archetypal process that has been systematically documented and transmitted through centuries of Western esoteric philosophy. The historical provenance of this transformative science extends to the Corpus Hermeticum, those enigmatic dialogues attributed to Hermes Trismegistus that synthesized Egyptian, Greek, and Near Eastern wisdom traditions in the early centuries of the Common Era. These texts established the foundational premise that would echo through Paracelsus, who in the 16th century declared that the true laboratory of the alchemist exists within the human soul itself. Carl Jung would later validate this intuition through his psychological research, demonstrating that alchemical symbolism represents a sophisticated map of individuation, the process by which the unconscious mind integrates with conscious awareness to produce a unified self. The Kybalion, that 20th century synthesis of Hermetic principles, articulated what adepts had always understood, that the external work of transmuting base metals into gold served as an elaborate metaphor for the internal work of transmuting the fragmented, reactive ego into an integrated conscious being. Dennis William Hawke's scholarship on the Emerald Tablet further illuminated how this ancient axiom, as above so below, establishes the correspondence between outer material processes and inner psycho-spiritual transformation. Eliphas Levi and Manly Palmer Hall, each in their respective centuries, emphasized that the great work demands not blind faith, but rigorous intellectual inquiry combined with disciplined practice. The premise that emerges from this lineage is unambiguous. Authentic spiritual alchemy is an internal, psychological, and spiritual endeavor that requires the practitioner to confront their own consciousness with unflinching honesty. The 7 signs of this process are not mystical experiences granted by grace, but observable phenomena that arise when one commits to the systematic transformation of their inner nature. These signs serve as diagnostic indicators that the great work has genuinely begun. The structural foundation of spiritual alchemy rests upon multiple interlocking systems that together compose a comprehensive map of human transformation. At the heart of this architecture lie the 3 essential principles first articulated by Paracelsus: sulfur, representing the soul and the principle of combustibility or passionate will; mercury, representing the spirit and the principle of volatility or mental fluidity; and salt, representing the body and the principle of fixity or material stability. These are not literal substances, but philosophical categories that describe the 3 fundamental aspects of human consciousness that must be purified, balanced, and united. The 7 classical stages of alchemical transformation, calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, and coagulation, represent a sequential process of breaking down, purifying, and reconstituting the components of consciousness. Each stage corresponds to specific psychological operations. Calcination burns away the ego's false certainties through confrontation with failure and limitation. Dissolution floods the psyche with previously repressed emotional content, breaking down rigid defensive structures. Separation discriminates between authentic aspects of self and internalized false beliefs. Conjunction begins the integration of previously split aspects of consciousness, particularly the union of masculine and feminine psychological principles that Jung termed anima and animus. Fermentation introduces a new level of being through what medieval alchemists called the philosophical putrefaction, a death of the old self that precedes rebirth. Distillation purifies the newly forming consciousness through repeated cycles of refinement, elevating awareness beyond personal concerns toward universal principles. Coagulation represents the final crystallization of the philosopher's stone, the stabilized state of integrated consciousness that remains permanent rather than transitory. This alchemical system interconnects profoundly with other Western esoteric traditions. The Kabbalistic tree of life maps onto the alchemical process, with the descent into Malkuth, physical manifestation, corresponding to calcination and dissolution, while the ascent through Yesod, Tifereth, and ultimately toward Kether parallels the ascending alchemical stages. The 10 Sephiroth can be understood as way stations in the refinement of consciousness, each representing both a divine attribute and a psychological state to be realized. Neoplatonic philosophy, particularly as articulated by Plotinus, describes reality as an emanation from the One through progressively denser levels of manifestation, with the goal of philosophy being the soul's return to unity with its source. This henosis, or mystical union, directly parallels the alchemical goal of dissolving multiplicity into unified consciousness. The Rosicrucian tradition, emerging in early 17th century Europe, synthesized alchemical, Kabbalistic, and Christian mystical elements into a coherent system emphasizing that spiritual transformation must be grounded in ethical action and service to humanity, a principle that distinguishes authentic alchemy from mere psychological narcissism. The mentality required of the adept undertaking this work cannot be overstated. First, one must cultivate what occult philosophy terms the magical will, not mere desire or wishful thinking, but the sustained, focused intention that directs all aspects of one's life toward a singular purpose. This will must be disciplined through practices that strengthen attention, overcome distraction, and maintain commitment despite obstacles. Second, the practitioner must internalize an occult ethics that recognizes the profound responsibility accompanying increased consciousness and power. As Eliphas Levi emphasized, knowledge of the hidden laws of nature confers ability to influence both self and others, making ethical discernment essential rather than optional. Third, and perhaps most challenging, the adept must maintain a disposition for radical doubt, not the corrosive skepticism that dismisses all claims to knowledge, but the philosophical suspension of certainty that allows one to question received beliefs, personal assumptions, and even direct experiences. This doubt prevents the premature crystallization of false certainty and keeps the mind open to deeper understanding. The practitioner must become comfortable with uncertainty, ambiguity, and the provisional nature of all conceptual frameworks, recognizing that the map is never the territory and that all symbolic systems, including alchemy itself, are scaffolding to be transcended once they have served their purpose. The 7 signs that manifest when spiritual alchemy authentically begins in one's life correspond to the classical stages of the great work, each representing both a psychological operation and an existential ordeal that fundamentally restructures consciousness. The first sign emerges as calcination, the experience of being burned by failure, limitation, and the collapse of ego structures one had mistaken for identity itself. The practitioner encounters situations that systematically undermine their sense of control, competence, and self-image. Career failures, relationship endings, health crises, or profound disappointments serve as the fire that reduces prideful certainty to ash. Psychologically, this corresponds to what Jung termed the confrontation with one's own inflation, the recognition that the ego's grandiose self-conception bears little relationship to reality. The calcined individual experiences a kind of psychological death, a burning away of false self-concepts that had provided security but prevented authentic development. This is not depression in the clinical sense, but rather a productive disillusionment that clears ground for new growth. The fire burns hottest where one is most attached, most identified, most certain of being right. The medieval alchemists understood this stage as the reduction of the unrefined ore to its essential components through intense heat. Metaphorically, the destruction of composite ego structures into their fundamental psychological elements. The second sign manifests as dissolution, the flooding of consciousness with previously repressed or denied psychological content. After calcination burns away rigid defenses, dissolution introduces water that softens, penetrates, and dissolves remaining boundaries. The practitioner experiences waves of emotion that had been held back by willpower or dissociation. Grief for losses never properly mourned, rage at injustices never acknowledged, shame about aspects of self that had been exiled from awareness. Dreams become vivid, even overwhelming. Memories resurface with disturbing clarity. The neat categories by which one had organized experience begin to blur and merge. Jung recognized this as the activation of unconscious material that floods into consciousness when defensive barriers weaken. The dissolution stage can feel like drowning. Emotions wash over the practitioner in waves, threatening to overwhelm rational thought and stable identity. Yet this flooding is necessary. What dissolves is not the authentic self, but the rigid structures that had contained and suppressed authentic experience. Medieval texts describe this as the transformation of the calcined ash into a liquid prima materia, the undifferentiated psychological material from which a new, more genuine self can be formed. The third sign appears as separation, the painstaking work of discriminating between what is authentically one's own and what has been internalized from external sources. After dissolution has mixed everything together in an undifferentiated soup of psychological content, separation applies the faculty of judgment to distinguish truth from falsehood, genuine from false, essential from accidental. The practitioner begins to recognize which beliefs were adopted uncritically from parents, culture, or peer groups, and which arise from authentic inner knowing, which desires are truly one's own, and which are implanted by advertising, social pressure, or the need for approval, which aspects of personality represent genuine self-expression and which are defensive adaptations to threatening environments. This stage requires brutal honesty and the willingness to question everything one had previously accepted as simply who I am. Psychologically, this corresponds to Jung's process of withdrawing projections, recognizing that qualities one had attributed to external people or circumstances often reflect aspects of one's own psyche. The separation stage employs what alchemists called philosophical discrimination, the ability to perceive subtle distinctions that escape ordinary awareness. This is intellectually and emotionally exhausting work, requiring sustained attention and the courage to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about one's own motivations, self-deceptions, and compromises. The fourth sign reveals itself as conjunction, the sacred marriage of opposites that had been held apart by unconscious conflict. After separation has identified and isolated the genuine components of psyche, conjunction begins the work of reuniting them in conscious relationship rather than unconscious conflict. The practitioner experiences the integration of masculine and feminine principles within their own consciousness, what Jung termed the anima and animus, the contrasexual aspects of psyche that must be acknowledged and integrated rather than projected onto external partners or repressed entirely. Logical thinking begins to cooperate with intuitive knowing rather than suppressing it. Strength embraces vulnerability rather than defending against it. Autonomy balances with connection. The individual discovers that apparent contradictions in their nature, the desire for both freedom and intimacy, for both certainty and mystery, for both achievement and rest, need not be resolved by choosing one and repressing the other, but can be held in creative tension. The alchemical texts describe this as the union of the Red King and White Queen, the solar and lunar principles, sulfur and mercury, in the hermetic vessel of the self. Psychologically, this represents the movement toward wholeness that occurs when previously split aspects of personality enter into conscious dialogue. The conjunction is not a merging that loses distinction, but a union that preserves difference while creating relationship. The fifth sign emerges as fermentation, the introduction of a new principle that cannot be derived from anything that came before. After the chemical marriage of conjunction, the alchemical work requires the addition of what medieval texts call the philosophical ferment or secret fire, a catalyst that initiates an entirely new level of transformation. Psychologically, this corresponds to what Jung termed the activation of the self, the organizing principle of the psyche that transcends the ego while including it. The practitioner experiences moments of profound insight, synchronistic events that seem to carry personal meaning, dreams, or visions that possess numinous quality, and an emerging sense of being guided by an intelligence larger than conscious will. This stage divides into two phases. The first, fermentation or putrefaction, in which the conjunction must die and decompose to release its spiritual essence, and the second, fermentation, in which this essence activates and enlivens the entire psychological structure. The death of the conjunction represents the recognition that even integrated consciousness remains limited if it remains purely personal. The practitioner must die to the idea that psychological wholeness is the ultimate goal, opening instead to transpersonal dimensions of experience. This is often experienced as a profound loneliness or alienation. One no longer fits comfortably in the ordinary world, yet has not yet fully entered the new state of being. The fermentation produces psychological effervescence, a kind of bubbling up of content from deep unconscious sources that carries an energy and quality distinctly different from material encountered in earlier stages. The sixth sign manifests as distillation, the repeated refinement and purification of consciousness through cycles of ascent and descent, expansion and concentration. After fermentation has introduced the new principle, distillation removes remaining impurities through a process analogous to the evaporation and condensation of liquid in an alchemical still. The practitioner alternates between states of elevated consciousness, moments of clarity, peace, and expanded awareness, and returns to ordinary or even degraded states of confusion, anxiety, and contraction. Each cycle, however, leaves behind something that cannot be taken by the descent, a permanent increment of understanding, a slight elevation of one's baseline state. Jung recognized this as the process by which insights gained in analysis must be repeatedly applied in daily life, tested against experience, refined through failure, and gradually integrated into one's actual behavior rather than remaining merely intellectual understanding. The distillation stage requires patience, as progress occurs slowly and often imperceptibly. The practitioner may feel they are going in circles, covering the same ground repeatedly, but each cycle operates at a slightly higher level. Medieval texts describe this as the extraction of the quintessence, the fifth element beyond earth, water, air, and fire, the spiritual principle that had been hidden within material existence. Psychologically, this represents the gradual stabilization of higher states of consciousness that initially appear only fleetingly. The volatile, transitory insights of early spiritual experience slowly become more fixed, more permanent, more reliably accessible. The seventh sign appears as coagulation, the final crystallization of the philosopher's stone, the permanent establishment of integrated conscious being. After distillation has purified consciousness to its essence, coagulation gives this purified essence material form, embodied presence, practical manifestation. The practitioner discovers that spiritual realization is not an escape from the body or the world, but a fuller inhabitation of both from a position of awakened consciousness. Elevated states of awareness no longer come and go but become one's stable ground of being. Ethical behavior flows naturally from authentic nature rather than requiring willful effort. Relationships deepen as projection decreases and genuine seeing becomes possible. Creative work expresses one's true voice rather than imitative performance. The coagulated consciousness possesses what medieval alchemists called the stone that is not a stone, a paradoxical state that is simultaneously spiritual and material, transcendent and immanent, unchanging and fully responsive to circumstance. Jung described this as the realization of the self, the goal of individuation, in which ego and self enter into right relationship, with ego serving as the conscious agent of the self's intentions rather than attempting to usurp the role of primary authority. The coagulated individual has become what they were always potentially, a human being who embodies spirit without denying matter, who expresses universal principles through particular actions, who lives simultaneously in time and beyond it. Among the 7 stages of alchemical transformation, the most profound crisis occurs during the transition from separation to conjunction, in the liminal space the medieval tradition termed the nigredo, the blackening, the confrontation with absolute darkness, the descent into what mystics across traditions have called the dark night of the soul. This is not merely a difficult passage, but the essential ordeal without which authentic transformation cannot occur. The nigredo represents the moment when the practitioner has successfully separated the false from the true in their psychological structure, but has not yet achieved the integration of conjunction. One exists in a state of radical dissolution, having relinquished all the comfortable identifications and beliefs that had previously provided meaning, purpose, and stability, yet without having found solid ground in any new understanding. The dark night is characterized by profound meaninglessness, not as an intellectual position, but as a lived experience in which nothing holds value, nothing provides comfort, nothing seems worth doing. The practitioner experiences what existential philosophy terms the confrontation with radical contingency, the recognition that there is no inherent meaning in existence, that all meaning is constructed, and that the meanings one had relied upon have been revealed as arbitrary fabrications. This psychological state manifests as symptoms that closely resemble clinical depression, pervasive hopelessness, loss of motivation, inability to experience pleasure, social withdrawal, profound fatigue, and recurrent thoughts of death. Yet the dark night differs from pathological depression in crucial ways that require philosophical rather than merely clinical analysis. Clinical depression typically involves a collapse of meaning that occurs without conscious intention, often triggered by neurobiological factors or overwhelming external circumstances, and represents a failure of psychological integration. The dark night, by contrast, occurs as the necessary consequence of having consciously dismantled psychological structures that had provided false but functional meaning. It is not a failure of the process, but its most essential operation, the ego's confrontation with its own limitations and the inevitability of its own death. The suffering of the dark night possesses what philosophers term teleological necessity. It serves an essential purpose in the transformative process and cannot be circumvented without aborting the great work entirely. Medieval alchemists understood that the blackening must be absolute, that one must descend to the very bottom of the psychological vessel, because any remaining attachment to false security will prevent the subsequent resurrection in authentic form. The practitioner must experience, not merely intellectually understand, that the ego cannot save itself, that personal will is insufficient, that something radically new must emerge from beyond the ego's control. Jung recognized this stage as the encounter with what he termed the self's intention to destroy the ego's presumption of authority. The dark night represents the ego's experience of being overpowered by the unconscious, not the personal unconscious of repressed memories and denied emotions, but the collective unconscious with its impersonal, transpersonal, and often terrifying archetypal forces. The practitioner encounters what religious traditions personified as demons, psychological forces that seem to possess autonomous will and malevolent intention. These are not literal entities, but aspects of one's own psyche that operate according to laws the conscious mind cannot control. The terror of the dark night lies precisely in this loss of control, this recognition that one is not the master in one's own house. The existential philosophers, particularly Kierkegaard and later the existentialists, understood this crisis as the confrontation with radical freedom, the vertiginous recognition that one is ultimately responsible for creating meaning in a universe that provides no inherent ground for values. This freedom is experienced not as liberation, but as unbearable burden. To exist authentically requires choosing oneself, choosing one's values, choosing one's actions, without any external authority or inherent nature to fall back upon. The dark night forces the practitioner to assume this responsibility fully, to recognize that they cannot defer to scripture, tradition, teacher, or even their own previously established personality as the source of their choices. What distinguishes the dark night from modern pathology is precisely this element of conscious engagement. The person undergoing spiritual crisis continues to work with their experience, continues to show up for the process, continues to maintain the container, even when everything within it has turned to chaos and darkness. They recognize, however dimly, that this suffering is not arbitrary, but participatory, that they have entered into it as part of a larger transformative intention. The pathologically depressed person wants nothing more than for the suffering to end. The person in the dark night recognizes that premature relief would mean failure of the work itself. The alchemical texts emphasized that the practitioner must remain in the vessel during the blackening, must not attempt to escape through distraction, substance use, or premature declarations of breakthrough. The suffering must be endured completely, not because suffering has inherent value, but because only complete descent allows for complete transformation. The ego that attempts to manage, control, or abbreviate the dark night will emerge from it only partially transformed, carrying forward unconscious material that will require later confrontation. The medieval adepts warned that those who flee from the Negredo will find themselves returned to it repeatedly, often in progressively more severe forms, until they finally consent to undergo it completely. This crisis serves multiple functions in the alchemical process. First, it destroys inflation, any remaining sense that one is special, chosen, or more advanced than others. The dark night is profoundly humbling, reducing the practitioner to recognition of their utter ordinariness and limitation. Second, it burns out attachment to spiritual experience itself, the subtle narcissism that pursues transformation for the sake of extraordinary states rather than for truth itself. Third, it creates the void that allows something genuinely new to emerge. Only in the absolute darkness, when all previous lights have been extinguished, can the new light be perceived. Not a light one generates through effort, but a light that shines from beyond the personal entirely. The culmination of the alchemical process, symbolized by the philosopher's stone, represents not an endpoint but the establishment of a new baseline of consciousness from which further development becomes possible. This integrated state manifests specific characteristics that distinguish authentic transformation from its counterfeits. The philosopher's stone, properly understood, is consciousness that has achieved what medieval texts called fixity, the ability to remain stable under conditions that would destabilize ordinary awareness. The integrated individual no longer fragments when confronted with challenging emotions, threatening information, or contradictory demands. They maintain coherence, not through rigid control but through flexible stability, like a tree that bends in wind without breaking. This psychological resilience emerges naturally from the work of integration rather than from defensive armoring. The transformed consciousness possesses what philosophers term heightened discernment, the ability to perceive subtle distinctions that escape ordinary awareness. This includes discernment of psychological dynamics in self and others, discernment of motivations that operate beneath conscious awareness, discernment of situations where action is required versus situations where patience serves better. The integrated individual sees more accurately because they have cleared away the distorting lenses of projection, denial, and wishful thinking. Ethical action becomes spontaneous rather than effortful. Having integrated shadow material and achieved authentic self-knowledge, the individual no longer needs to consult external rules or internal debate to determine right action. Appropriate response arises naturally from accurate perception of what the situation calls for. This does not mean the transformed person never errs, but rather that error is quickly recognized and corrected because the perceptual apparatus has been calibrated through the alchemical work. The integration produces what Jung termed the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold opposites in tension without compulsively choosing between them or collapsing into contradiction. The integrated individual can be simultaneously strong and vulnerable, confident and humble, engaged and detached. They recognize that apparent contradictions often represent complementary perspectives on a more comprehensive truth. For the modern individual, this transformation manifests in practical domains. Relationships cease to be driven by unconscious projection and neediness, becoming instead collaborations between two whole persons. Work becomes an expression of authentic creativity and service, rather than a performance for approval or compensation. Political engagement shifts from tribal identification to principled participation. The transformed individual engages the world more effectively precisely because they are less reactive, less desperate, less driven by unconscious compulsion. The integration brings with it profound ethical responsibility. Those who have undergone the great work possess increased capacity to influence both themselves and others. This power must be wielded with extraordinary care. The Hermetic axiom, to know, to will, to dare, to keep silent, takes on new meaning. The integrated individual recognizes that not all knowledge should be shared, that power must be tempered by wisdom, that discretion is essential to avoid inflicting one's insights on those unprepared to receive them. The discipline and rigor, exemplified by the Hermetic school, proves essential because authentic transformation cannot occur through casual engagement or wishful thinking. The alchemical process requires sustained commitment, systematic practice, intellectual rigor, and the courage to face what others flee from. The school provides the container, the methodology, the conceptual frameworks, and the practical guidance that distinguish the great work from mere psychological self-improvement. Without such disciplined approach, seekers remain trapped in cycles of partial transformation. Brief insights followed by regression, momentary openings followed by defensive closure. The rigor ensures completeness of the work, ensures that no essential stage is bypassed, ensures that the transformation stabilizes rather than evaporates when difficulties arise. The 7 signs of spiritual alchemy manifest not as supernatural phenomena, but as natural consequences of consciousness turning back upon itself with uncompromising honesty and sustained will. The seeker does not find the philosopher's stone through external searching, but forges it in the crucible of their own awareness, where every certainty must be melted down, every impurity must be burned away, and every fragment must be consciously integrated into a unified whole. The gold that transforms the alchemist is not extracted from ore, but from the very fire of attention that reduces the false self to ash and allows authentic being to crystallize from the refined essence that remains.